Hey everybody, it's Charles from HumbleMechanic.com. Today, we're removing the front suspension from the white Wookie. So, like I mentioned, we are pulling the front suspension out of the GTI. And we're doing this for a couple of reasons. One, I want to get the suspension out. It needs new bushings anyway, so I'm going to put new bushings in it. I'm going to paint it, make it all nice and pretty. I also need all of that stuff out of the way so I can do the final taping off, prepping, and painting of the engine compartment. And rather than do it piece by piece, I'm just going to go ahead and drop the whole entire front end. A few things before we get going. About a week and a half before actually removing the suspension, I went around the car and all the bolts that I could get to, I treated with WD40 Specialist Rust Release Penetrant. I know what you're thinking, Charles, that's not rust. I live in Canada, we get rust. And I get it, and I feel for you guys, believe me, I do. But just because this is not caked on metal dissolving rust, I wanted to do as much pre-treatment as possible. I wanted to get this Rust Release Penetrant into the bolt holes and try and lubricate and break down anything that might actually be in there. There's no sense in risking it if I don't have to. As you guys know, WD-40 has been a great supporter of the GTI build and a great supporter of this exact episode as well. So shout out to WD-40 for sponsoring today's show. There's also one other thing that I did, and looking back on it, I really wish I would have done a different way. When we dropped the whole entire front suspension, I really wish I would have dropped it onto a roller pad instead of right onto the floor. I'm not worried about any damage. I'm not worried about the rotor sitting on the ground. The dust shields didn't get bent. It just would have made moving it around the garage a heck of a lot easier. So if you're following this path and following this video, you really want to look at either dropping it on wood blocks and then sliding a roller pad underneath it, or simply dropping it down onto a roller pad. Again, looking back, that would have been a way better way to do it. I just wasn't thinking about it at the time. So there is your pre-warning. If you're gonna follow this video, I highly recommend doing that. One last thing, there's a point in this video where I have an impact gun and I have a chrome socket on it. So don't worry about telling me that that's not proper. I know it's the only socket that I had. I didn't really have a choice because I wanted to use the impact and I wanted to use the socket. I wanted to get it done. So officially, proper tool usage says that we use impact sockets on an impact gun. So I just wanted to put all that out there because I know that you guys are more than happy to let me know about it in the comments, which I appreciate. But I will have you know, I was wearing safety glasses and steel-toed shoes, and that's enough rambling for me, so let's get going. So we're going to start with taking off the caliper and the carrier. You could just take the caliper off and leave the carrier on, or you can take them both off as an assembly. My main point here is I don't want to open the brake system because I don't want to just have an open brake line for an extended period of time. If this were a non-ABS car, that wouldn't be as big of a deal, but bleeding the air out of the ABS module can be challenging. Just because I'm opening it doesn't mean air is going to get in, but it's not something I really want to take the chance on right now. So I'm going to start by loosening the caliper bolts. Before starting, I actually soaked all of the bolts that we're potentially going to be removing in WD-40 Rust Penetrant. So this is what I soaked everything in. It's not the regular blue can. This is their specialist stuff. It seems to work incredibly well. I got a little bit of heat, more in jest than anything about this not being rust, and you're totally right. But it's still a good idea to hit everything you're going to loosen with penetrating oil. It'll get in there, it'll provide lubrication so that you don't try and turn the threads and really tear the threads up. It doesn't guarantee you're not going to mess anything up, but boy does it help out a bunch. I'll loosen the lower one. This is when I wish I wouldn't have left my electric ratchet at the shop. Now before I take the top bolt out, I'm going to prepare a metal coat hanger. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut it so that I can sling it through the caliper carrier and hook it on the frame of the car. That will prevent it from hanging on the rubber hose and causing damage to the rubber hose. Some people just like to bend these. I actually like to cut them. As long as you're not hanging the caliper on the hose, it's fine. Good place for a bungee cord as well. If you're struggling to loosen one of the bolts,
pushing up on the bracket a little bit can actually relieve some tension and make it a bit easier. Now we just nurse our caliper off. If it's really stuck on there, a pry bar works wonders to loosen it. So we're gonna go right through the middle of the caliper, hopefully. There we go. And I'm gonna hook this in the frame of the car so that it's not hanging on that metal rubber hose. On this one, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna remove the bolt for the bracket first. I think that'll work out a little bit easier. And one tip, anytime you possibly can, put the bolt back where it came from so that it doesn't end up getting lost. Just like we did on the other side, we'll go ahead and remove these bolts. No turbo on the VRs from the factory. They were all naturally aspirated or normally aspirated. So here's the question. What do you guys say when talking about a car that's not turbocharged or supercharged? Normally aspirated or naturally aspirated? So we got our lower bolt out. I'm gonna go ahead and cut our coat hanger up. Let's go ahead and put our hanger through. Now, if I were just doing brakes, I could sling this from the strut or the spring, but all that's coming out, so I need to get it away from all that. Also, before we finish up in the front corners, we want to make sure that we take the wiring looms off. So we're going to unclip the two rubber grommets from the strut. We also need to make sure that we get our sensor wire off and that nothing else is attached to the strut tower. Remember, like I said, it's always a good idea to take the bolt and put it back in its home, if at all possible. I mentioned that I sprayed all this stuff with the WD40 Rust penetrant. You are going to be putting these parts back on. You want to make sure that if you get any kind of that rust penetrant or any other chemical really that's not a cleaner on any brake components, that you really do a good job removing it. Otherwise you can run into issues with your brakes. Another tip to prevent your sockets from rolling, stand them up. That'll help that not to happen. There we go. Whew, these babies are tight. They've probably never been removed from the car. So they actually look in pretty good shape. They look like they're in pretty good shape. A lot of times suspension bolts are torque to yield, so you'll want to be aware if they're torque to yield or one-time use, you replace them. Notice that I'm not laying directly underneath this. I'm kind of off to the side. That's just in case some junk falls down, or like you see a drip right here of the rust penetrant that I sprayed on it earlier. It's to keep myself as clean and as safe as possible. All right. So these are two very obviously different bolts. This is the one from the back. Uh-oh, I really hope, don't mess with me if there is one. I don't want to know. And for the other side, we do the same thing. Let's see. I will go ahead and tell you, impact chrome socket is not the best way, but unfortunately I don't have an impact socket of this size. As always, we're gonna wing it. May not have seen it. A little more rust came out of this one, but it still came out pretty easy. You see a little oxidation right here on the bolt. All right, so our next step is going to be removing the connection for the steering gear. So I'm gonna cut this zip tie. Pull the boot up. We can see our connection right here. We just need to take this bolt out. One tip is to lock the steering column before taking any of this out. And if you can, lock it in the center position so that you don't have to worry about the steering gear getting twisted. That way you don't accidentally put it together not clocked properly. On most Volkswagens, this is going to be a 13mm bolt, and on a lot of Volkswagens, this is actually inside the car, so you would gain access to it underneath where the steering wheel is and the driver's floorboard. Pay attention too, because this one looks like it has a shim, so if there's any kind of shim or anything, that's got to go back in the car. All right, our next step is to take the cap for the strut off. There's a couple of ways you can do this. There are tools that go onto the strut and hold the nut so you can turn it, or hold this piece and turn the nut. That's one way. There's also the way of hitting it with an impact. Hitting it with an impact is probably not the absolute best way to do it because it can actually cause the strut to spin inside the housing. If it's going back in the car, you may not want to do that at first, but there are times where that's the only way it'll come apart because we're replacing the suspension components and this has probably never been removed. I'm going to go ahead and try hitting it with an impact first and we'll see if that works. So clearly that didn't work. What does that mean? It means we try it this way. There we go. What I ended up having to do is support the wrench on the fender and put pressure holding it down in order to hold it tight enough to be able to move the nut with the wrench. This is something you want to be really careful of though, because stripping this out on the inside is very, very easy. Once it's loose enough, you can actually turn the other one with the ratchet, and that'll go a little bit easier. There we go, we got it out. There's our nut. It's a little beat up. I would probably go ahead and replace that. With this side done, let's take care of the other side. On the other side, the impact method didn't work. Let's try it on this side and see if it will. That was what was supposed to happen on the other side. The really good thing though, is that I'm glad you guys got to see both ways to do it. The way with two tools is actually a better way, especially going back together with it, because you can apply the proper torque. But because we're going to be replacing all this stuff, I'm not super worried about it. Next step, we're gonna try and drop the whole entire subframe and get this suspension out of this car. All right, our next step is to go ahead and use a floor jack to support the subframe on the car. Now, to get access to this bolt here, there's two ways we can do it. We can get on it with a wrench right here and go this way, or the way the control arm's set up, it has a hole in it so we can gain access right through it. That was surprisingly loose. I mean, it wasn't loose, but not nearly as tight as the other ones were. And we'll go ahead and repeat it for the other side. And the final subframe bolt. What's that? Now before this comes all the way out, you really want to make sure you're 100% supported with that floor jack. Otherwise it could come crashing down. All right, now that we have all of the bolts out, it's time to drop the subframe. This is where if you have someone helping you, you really want them right by you to watch and make sure that you didn't forget a bracket or something like that. In addition to the subframe, we are going to be having a power steering line come along with it that I left on the rack. 3, 2, 1. Let's see how We're looking. All right, so at this point I'm gonna stop and I'm gonna take a look at the steering gear and make sure that's coming out straight. If it's not, you can hit it with a little bit of lubricant or use a screwdriver to pry it loose. Just be really careful. I'm gonna also look at our strut towers. That's coming down good. All right, make sure we don't have anything hanging. Our exhaust is probably gonna end up hanging a bit, but that's okay. Our brakes are out of the way and clear. Looks like we're hung a little bit on this side. All right, it's definitely our steering gear that's hung. So we'll just go ahead and give this a little bit of persuasion. It didn't need that much, a very little bit. We're just gonna keep coming down nice and easy. It would probably be best if I could reposition this on the jack, but I don't think that's gonna happen. So we're probably just gonna come on down with it. This is never as beautiful and glamorous as you have it pictured in your head. That's all right. All right, well, there we go. We're down and out. You guys got to see it in all its glory. All right, guys, there we have it. Our front suspension is completely removed. This would be pretty bad suspension geometry right here. We're going to be replacing the power steering rack bushing, sway bar bushing, control arm bushings, ball joints, tie rods. Basically, if it's rubber in the front, it's getting replaced. Here's what a Mark III front suspension looks like.
All right, guys, there you have it. We have the suspension out. Again, I wish I would have put this on some kind of roller to make it easier to move around the garage. But if you have any questions or comments, you know where they go. If you like this video, throw it a thumbs up on YouTube. I always appreciate that. You can also subscribe on YouTube or on the blog at homeofamechanic.com. Follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and of course on Snapchat. All right, guys, hey, thanks so much for watching. Thanks to WD40 for hooking up the Rust Release Penetrant. And if you guys have missed any GTI videos, don't forget, you can always go back and watch them. The beauty of YouTube. Look forward to more videos coming soon. Guys, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.